So you live in the most livable city. How do you feel?
Well, can't complain.
What do you think made your city win the top spot?
Well, it's pretty safe to be honest, and nothing much out of the ordinary ever happens. And even when something like COVID happens, it's managed pretty smoothly.
What would you say about the infrastructure?
What's that?
Well, it's the basic systems we need for the economy to run smoothly, like roads, pipelines, airports.
Oh yeah, that stuff. We have great infrastructure.
What is livability? Livability is basically how suitable an area is for living. But what determines livability? Well, we can say that there are 6 key areas: stability, healthcare, culture, environment, education, infrastructure. Alright, that's nice, but what the heck does that actually mean? Well, let's try to answer that right now. First up, stability. Basically, this is about how much crime there is and whether a city feels safe overall. This is an important part of livability because safety is a key human need, just like food and water. Next up, healthcare. This is basically asking what's the access look like for private and public healthcare, and how readily available is medication. Culture. Alright, how's the corruption? What about the censorship levels? What about social restrictions? And most importantly, how good is the food and the drink? The environment factor is looking at what's the climate like? How easy is it to buy the things that you want? And how's the sports scene? Do they have enough sporting facilities? Education is basically asking the key question, how hard is it to find a good school? Finally, the factor of infrastructure. Are the roads bumpy? Is the water clean to drink? And do the lights go out often? But why do livability rankings exist in the first place? Why go to all the effort to even make them? Well, they're primarily created for determining something called hardship allowance, determining whether an employee who's getting sent overseas should receive an additional bonus for any hardships that they may encounter overseas that they might not encounter at home. For example, sending your employee to a first world country will probably have little to no hardship bonus required, while sending them to a second world country might need a little, while a third world country trip would probably require the maximum hardship bonus attached. Now, looking at the top cities, what do these cities have in common? Well, first of all, no brainer, they're normally in rich countries. So countries with large GDPs, specifically large GDP per capita. And they're normally not too big or too small, so what we would call a medium-sized population. And finally, we see that they tend to be low density. This partly explains why major cities don't tend to rank as highly in the livability rankings. The success of these cities tends to also be their downfall because they tend to attract a lot of people, which also means greater attraction for crime which means they tend to take a beating on stability ratings. And their larger populations tend to mean that their infrastructure just can't keep up. Okay, it makes sense why big cities like New York and London might not be included in the top 10 rankings, but why not a single American city at all? Well, this probably largely comes down to healthcare, with healthcare being a much larger percentage of an individual's expenditure in the US relative to other first world countries. All cities within the US take a hit on the healthcare evaluations for livability. But livability rankings, while cool to look at, might actually not be that useful, since they may not actually give us the full picture. This is because, being designed for expats in mind, livability rankings don't really care about the actual city's residents' experience. Livability rankings can fall short with consideration to things that most residents care about, such as affordability. Specifically, housing affordability. This mismatch is most visible by the top 10 cities also tending to be some of the most expensive places to live in the entire world. Further cementing the fact that livability rankings are designed for expats and not for regular people is the emphasis on private education availability. Yeah, again, that's all G, but that's not what most people may care about. Public education availability may be far more important to some people. Moving on from the first fatal flaw, which is the consideration only in terms of an expat's perspective, is the second major flaw: how a city's borders are determined. See, most livability rankings only consider a city's CBD and perhaps the inner suburbs. But this ignores the large proportion of the city's population which lives outside these inner suburbs. For example, public transport may be good for inner suburbs but non-existent for outer. Someone living on the right, let's say, is within the same livable city, would have a tough time understanding how where he lives is livable. Okay, so we looked at what livability was in terms of the 6 key livability factors. We also talked about why these livability rankings exist. They are designed for expatriates in mind. We looked at what the top cities share in common, and then related this to why some cities don't tend to show up. For example, major population cities as well as American cities. We also looked at how livability rankings may not give us the full picture. Firstly, being designed for expats and not considering affordability, and being skewed towards looking at the availability of private education. And finally, the definition of a city being confined to an urban centre, not considering the fringes of the city.
Livability is subjective at the end of the day, and where you live is probably your most livable city, and that's okay.